Most people look back at the 80s as one of the greatest eras in music, but for Huey Lewis and the News, it wasn't all hits and good times, because at the same time they were topping the charts, they were also dealing with a controversy involving one of the biggest movie songs of the decade, a song that sounded a little too familiar and eventually led to a lawsuit. And when you hear the two songs side by side, you'll understand why. The mid-1980s was a huge time for Huey Lewis and the News. They had built a sound that was catchy, polished, and instantly recognizable. By 1984, they were at the top of their game. I want a new drug, one that does what it should. Hit records, heavy radio play, mainstream success. But at the same time, something else was happening behind the scenes, something that would connect their music to one of the biggest songs of the decade, in a way they probably didn't expect. In 1984, the band released I Want a New Drug. The song became a hit, and it stood out for its groove and structure, and it's also one of my personal favorites. It had a very specific feel to it, the kind of sound that once you hear it, you recognize it immediately. And that detail would become very important. Around the same time, the film Ghostbusters was in development. The filmmakers needed a theme song, and according to Huey Lewis, he was approached about being involved in it. But due to scheduling and other commitments, he declined. Soon after, Ray Parker Jr. released Ghostbusters. The song became a massive success. It was everywhere, and it quickly became one of the most recognizable songs of the 80s. But as it gained popularity, people started to notice something. Listeners began pointing out similarities between Ghostbusters and I Want a New Drug. Not necessarily identical, but close enough that it raised questions. The rhythm, the structure, the overall feel. And once you hear both songs, it's hard not to compare them. Because of those similarities, Huey Lewis and the News filed a lawsuit against Ray Parker Jr.
For some reason, he attacked me, and I don't really think I had anything to do with it.
The case was eventually settled out of court. The exact terms of the settlement were kept confidential, which means to this day, the full details aren't publicly known. But the story didn't end there. Years later, Huey Lewis spoke publicly about the situation in an interview, and that created another issue, because part of the settlement agreement required that certain details remain private. As a result, Ray Parker Jr. filed a lawsuit against him for violating that agreement. Who you gonna call? Which adds another layer to the story, even after the original case had already been settled. While all this was happening, something else was going on in Huey Lewis's career. In 1985, Back to the Future was released, and Huey Lewis and the News were directly involved. Their song, The Power of Love, was featured in the film, and it became one of the biggest hits. That's the power of love. But there's another side to that success. Because the song wasn't just a hit on its own, it also became closely tied to the success of Back to the Future. And over time, Huey Lewis has suggested that looking back, the situation may not have been as favorable as it could have been. Not because the song wasn't successful, but because of how much value it created overall, for both the music and the film. And like many artists in similar situations, it's something that might have been approached differently in hindsight. When people think back to the 1980s, they usually remember the music, the hits, the energy, the good times. And for Huey Lewis and the News, there was plenty of that. But at the same time, there were also moments behind the scenes that most people didn't see. A situation where two songs became connected in a way that led to questions and eventually legal action. And even now, it's one of those stories that still gets brought up because once you hear the similarities, it's hard to ignore them. And it leaves you wondering where the line is between inspiration and something more. And maybe that's the part that makes the 80s so interesting. Not just the music itself, but the stories behind it. The things that weren't always obvious at the time, but became part of the story later on.